The Whispering Pines. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and nature. I had always found solace in the woods, far from the noise of the city. I packed my gear, strapped on my hiking boots, and drove to the remote trailhead that promised breathtaking views and tranquility. As I stepped onto the path, a sense of excitement washed over me. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I hiked deeper into the forest, the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves my only companions. Hours passed, and I finally found a clearing that seemed perfect for camping. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. As dusk fell, the world around me changed. The sounds of the forest quieted, leaving an eerie stillness. I lit my campfire and watched the flames dance, their flickering light casting long shadows. But then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, floating through the trees. "Help me!" I froze, my heart racing. I strained to listen, but it faded away. I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks. After all, the forest had its own language. But as I tried to relax, the whisper returned, clearer this time. "Help me, please." The voice was pleading, echoing through the trees. I stood up, peering into the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. "Hello." I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. The forest felt alive, watching me waiting. I tried to shake off the unease and turned back to the fire, but the whispers grew louder, circling around me. "Help me! Help me!" The plea was unmistakable. I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back. Maybe someone was lost nearby. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and decided to investigate. I stepped away from the warmth of the fire, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The whispers grew frantic, echoing through the trees. "Help me, over here." I followed the voice, deeper into the woods, where the trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to warn me to turn back. I called out again, "Where are you?" But the only reply was the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Then I stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin that seemed to materialize out of the shadows. The windows were dark and broken, the door hanging ajar. My gut twisted with instinctual fear, but I couldn't ignore the cries. I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the cabin's rotting wood. "Help me!" The voice came from inside, a child's voice now, laced with desperation. "Please, I'm trapped." I pushed the door open, its creak sounding like a warning. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but dust and cobwebs. But then I noticed a shape in the corner, a small figure huddled beneath a tattered blanket. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure looked up, revealing hollow eyes and a pale, gaunt face. "Help me." "I've been waiting." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What happened? "They took me," the child whispered, the words escaping like a puff of icy breath. "They said I can't leave." Suddenly, the air shifted, and the whispers surrounded me, growing louder and more chaotic. "Join us! Join us!" Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut. The whispers morphed into cries, pleading and angry, filling my ears. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the forest seemed to close in, muffling my cries. Desperately, I turned back to the figure, but it was gone, replaced by darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Shadows stretched toward me, clawing at my legs, pulling me into the abyss. I could hear the whispers now, hundreds of voices merging into one. "Help us! Help us!" With every ounce of strength, I lunged for the door. To my shock, it swung open, and I stumbled into the night, the cool air hitting my face like a slap. I ran blindly back to my campsite, the whispers trailing behind me, relentless. When I finally reached the fire, I collapsed, gasping for breath. The flames flickered in the darkness, casting an eerie glow. But the whispers didn't stop. They surrounded me, echoing in my mind, drowning out my thoughts. "Join us! Help us!" I packed my gear in a frenzy, fear igniting every movement. As I'd fled the woods, the whispers faded, but I knew they were still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting hiker. I would never return to those woods again, but the memory of that night, the pleading voices, would haunt me forever. The abandoned trail. I had always loved the thrill of discovering uncharted territories, and the abandoned trail near Lake Crest was rumored to be one of the most beautiful hikes in the region. The locals, however, warned that few returned from it. Naturally, this only piqued my curiosity. The sun was high as I parked at the trailhead, the overgrown path barely visible. Armed with my camera and a backpack full of supplies, I stepped onto the trail. Thick trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches forming an almost tunnel-like effect. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, a mix that felt both inviting and foreboding. As I hiked deeper, the silence became unnerving. Birds, usually a constant presence, had vanished, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, attributing it to my imagination. But the sensation lingered, prickling at the back of my neck. Hours passed, and I reached a clearing that revealed a breathtaking view of the lake, shimmering like a blue gem amidst the trees. I took out my camera, snapping pictures and momentarily forgetting my unease. That was until I noticed something out of place, a dilapidated signpost, its letters faded and obscured by moss. I approached it, squinting to make out the words, "Beware, do not enter. The lost ones wait." A chill crept down my spine. I laughed nervously, thinking it was just an old prank, but the ominous tone of the message made my skin crawl. Feeling adventurous, I pressed on, convinced I could find the source of the legend. As I ventured further, the path narrowed, and the trees closed in around me, casting long shadows. The whispers returned, just like in the stories. "Help us! Help us!" My heart raced. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice shaky. Silence answered me. The sun dipped lower, casting a twilight glow that made the woods even more surreal. I knew I should turn back, but an inexplicable pull urged me forward. It was then that I stumbled upon an old campsite, long abandoned. The remnants of a fire pit and scattered belongings told tales of past campers. As I inspected the area, I noticed something glinting in the dirt. I knelt down and uncovered a rusted knife, its blade stained dark. The feeling of dread intensified. I stood, scanning the tree line. It felt as if something or someone was watching me. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity pushed me to explore deeper into the forest. Minutes later, I found myself at the edge of another clearing, this one dominated by a massive, gnarled tree. Its bark twisted and blackened, resembling clawed hands reaching skyward. At its base, something white caught my eye, bones, scattered and bleached, half buried in the earth. Panic flooded my veins. I stumbled back, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. "Join us! Join us!" I turned to flee, my heart pounding, but the ground beneath me shifted, roots snaking around my ankles, pulling me down. I struggled, but the whispers enveloped me, drowning out my screams. "Stay with us, forever!" With a final desperate surge, I broke free and sprinted toward the path, branches clawing at my clothes as if trying to keep me from escaping. I raced through the darkness, not daring to look back, the whispers echoing in my ears. Finally, I burst into the clearing where I had first taken my pictures, gasping for breath. The lake was calm, a deceptive tranquility after the chaos I had just experienced. I scrambled to my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see figures lurking in the shadows. Instead, the forest loomed silently, an ominous sentinel guarding its secrets. To this day, I can still hear those whispers. Sometimes, late at night, they echo in my dreams. I never returned to that trail, but part of me wonders what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer. The shadow on the trail. The plan was simple. A weekend hike in the Appalachian Mountains. I was an experienced hiker, but this time I was alone. My friends had backed out at the last minute, but I needed the solitude. I packed my gear, filled my water bottles, and set out early, the rising sun promising a beautiful day ahead. The trail was steep, winding through dense woods that felt alive. Birds sang overhead, and I breathed in the fresh, earthy scent. But as I climbed higher, the atmosphere shifted. The chirping faded, and an uneasy silence enveloped me. I shrugged it off. Sometimes the woods just felt strange. Hours passed, and I reached a plateau with stunning views of the mountains rolling into the distance. I paused to catch my breath, pulling out my camera to snap a few shots. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape moving among the trees. I squinted, but it vanished before I could focus. Just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the shiver creeping down my spine. I continued hiking, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I pressed on, I noticed the trail becoming less defined, overgrown with weeds and brambles. I hesitated but decided to keep going. Maybe this was part of the adventure. Just as I was starting to feel uneasy again, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, floating through the trees. "Help me! Help me!" My heart raced. I glanced around, expecting to see another hiker or someone in distress. "Hello, is anyone there?" Silence was my only answer. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination. A chill crept into the air, and I picked up the pace. Suddenly, I spotted the dark shape again, this time closer. It was a figure, a shadow standing still among the trees, its form indistinct and wavering like smoke. I could feel my pulse quicken as I approached. "Hello!" I called out, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it seemed to melt back into the woods, and I felt an overwhelming urge to follow it, as if it was beckoning me deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed the direction where it had vanished. The whispers returned, swirling around me, growing louder and more insistent. "Help us! Help us!" I stumbled upon a small clearing with a stone well at its center. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The well looked ancient, its stones covered in moss and grime. Something about it felt wrong. Then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help us? Please." I peered into the well, but the darkness within seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the light. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if something inside was calling to me. I leaned closer, and suddenly, a hand shot out of the darkness, grabbing my wrist with a cold iron grip. I screamed, yanking my arm back and stumbling away. The whispers turned into frantic cries, echoing around me, growing more chaotic. "Stay with us, forever." Panic surged through me as I turned and ran, branches clawing at my face and arms. The dark figure reappeared in my peripheral vision, trailing me like a shadow. I could hear its footsteps, light yet relentless, echoing in the stillness. I burst through the trees, racing back to the main trail, but it felt as if the woods were shifting, twisting around me. I couldn't find my way. Desperately, I stumbled over roots and rocks, breathless and terrified. Finally, I burst into a familiar clearing, the plateau where I had taken my earlier photos. The mountains loomed large in the distance, but I felt far from safe. I turned around, my heart pounding, expecting to see the shadow behind me. But the woods were silent, the whispers gone. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. Just as I thought I might be safe, I felt a chill wash over me. Looking over my shoulder, I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees. The figure was there, its shape clearer now, a gaunt silhouette of a person, hollow eyes locked onto mine. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through me. I sprinted down the trail, heart racing, not daring to look back. The whispers returned, echoing in my mind, growing louder with every step. "Help us! Join us!" I finally reached my car, fumbling with the keys as I fought to catch my breath. The moment I slammed the door shut and locked it, the whispers faded, replaced by the pounding of my heart. I sped away, the mountain behind me shrouded in darkness. I never returned to those woods. Sometimes I can still hear the whispers in my dreams, the pleading voices calling me back, but I know better now. Some shadows should never be followed. The Lost Hiker. I had always been drawn to the mountains. The way they towered over everything else made me feel small, yet connected to something vast. When I heard about the Lost Hiker Trail, I was intrigued. It was said to be beautiful, but it was also the site of many disappearances. The locals talked about it in hushed tones, warning that those who ventured too deep often didn't return. Ignoring the warnings, I set out early one Saturday morning. The sky was clear and the air was crisp. I parked at the trailhead, my excitement outweighing any lingering doubts. As I began my hike, the sounds of the forest enveloped me. The rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the crunch of gravel underfoot. The trail was well marked at first, winding through dense woods before opening up to stunning vistas. I stopped frequently to take pictures, reveling in the solitude. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the atmosphere changed. Shadows lengthened, and an unsettling stillness settled over the woods. As I continued, I noticed the signs warning about the lost hiker trail. They were old, their paint peeling and faded. The last one I saw read, "Turn back. Don't follow the whispers." My heart raced. I had been so lost in my own thoughts that I hadn't noticed how quiet it had become. Just then, I heard it, a faint whisper, almost like a child's voice carried on the wind. "Help, please." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity got the better of me. I called out, "Is anyone there?" The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, over here." Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, straying off the main path. The trees seemed to close in around me as I pushed through the underbrush, the whispers guiding me deeper into the woods. My heart raced with both fear and intrigue. I stumbled upon a small clearing dominated by an ancient, twisted tree. Its gnarled branches stretched out like fingers, and at its base lay a pile of stones, worn smooth by time. Kneeling down, I brushed away some leaves and discovered a faded photo, a picture of a young woman, her smile frozen in time. I shuddered, feeling a chill creep into the air. The whispers swirled around me, almost desperate now. "Help us, we're lost." The temperature dropped, and I felt a presence, heavy and oppressive. I turned to leave, but the whispers intensified, filling my mind with chaotic voices. "Stay with us, don't leave." Panicking, I ran back toward the main trail, but the forest felt disorienting, the trees shifting and closing in on me. The sun had nearly set, and the shadows were now thick and foreboding. In my frantic escape, I tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. The figure of a woman stood between the trees, her eyes hollow, her mouth moving in a silent scream. "Help us! Help us!" I ran, my breath coming in sharp gasps, branches tearing at my clothes. The whispers surrounded me, almost drowning out my thoughts. I could feel their desperation, their need pulling me back, but I fought against it. Finally, I burst back onto the main trail, my heart pounding. I could hear the whispers fading behind me, but I didn't stop running. I didn't look back until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. As I drove away, I could still hear the echoes of the voices in my mind, the haunting play that would linger long after I had left. "Help us, don't leave." It's been years since that day, but I never returned to those mountains. Sometimes I wonder about the woman in the photograph, lost in those woods. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the whispers, begging me to come back. The campfire tale. It was supposed to be a bonding trip for me and my friends, a weekend of hiking, camping, and storytelling beneath the stars. We chose a secluded spot in the foothills, far from civilization, where the air was fresh and the nights were dark. The first day passed in laughter and adventure as we hiked the nearby trails, but as dusk fell, the mood shifted. Around the campfire, we roasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories, each tale more chilling than the last. As the flames flickered, I could see the unease creeping into my friend's eyes, especially when Jake leaned in and said, "Have you guys heard about the Forest of Whispers?" I rolled my eyes, but the others leaned closer, intrigued. Jake continued, his voice low. "They say a hiker disappeared there years ago. His friends heard him calling for help, but when they found him, he was never the same. He kept muttering about whispers in the trees, voices that lured him deeper into the forest." A chill ran through me as I glanced at the dark woods surrounding us. I laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's just a story." But Jake was undeterred. "They say if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers yourself. They're meant to lure you in, make you one of them." The fire crackled, casting eerie shadows on the trees. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, but the story stuck with me. As we settled into our tents later, I lay awake, listening to the night sounds, the rustling leaves, distant owls, and an unsettling silence that enveloped everything. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely discernible. "Help me, please." I froze, heart pounding. Surely it was just my imagination. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me, I'm lost. I shook my friends awake, panic bubbling in my chest. Did you hear that? Jake sat up, eyes wide. Hear what? I listened intently, and the whisper faded, replaced by silence. I felt foolish, but the fear lingered. It's just the wind, I finally muttered, trying to convince myself. But as I lay back down, the whisper returned, now sounding closer. Help me! Help me! I couldn't take it anymore. I crept out of my tent, flashlight in hand, drawn toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing trees that loomed like sentinels. Hello, I called, but only silence replied. I edged deeper into the woods, the whispers wrapping around me, growing more frantic. Help us! Help us! The air felt thick, almost oppressive. I began to question my sanity. Maybe it was just a trick of the mind, or perhaps I had ventured too far from the camp. But as I turned to head back, I saw a figure lurking among the trees, a shadow that shifted and swayed. Who's there? I shouted, the fear rising in my throat. The figure melted into the darkness, but the whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. Join us. Stay with us. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but branches snagged at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. The whispers morphed into a cacophony of voices, pleading and angry. You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have listened. I burst back into the clearing, my friends still asleep, oblivious to the nightmare I had just experienced. I stumbled back to my tent, heart racing, desperate to shake the feeling of dread. The next morning, I tried to act normal, but the whispers haunted me. As we hiked out, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Each rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. Once we reached the car, I thought I was safe. But as we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. The trees stood silent, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trail, its mouth moving as if whispering farewell. To this day, I can still hear those voices in the back of my mind. Sometimes, when the wind rustles the leaves outside my window, I wonder if the whispers are calling for me again. I can't help but think that some stories should never be told, and some woods should never be entered. The cabin in the woods. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a solo camping adventure in the remote woods of Pine Hollow. I craved the solitude, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life. I packed my gear, set out early, and drove down winding roads until I reached the trailhead. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled my lungs. The hike started off beautifully, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting playful shadows on the ground. I followed the well-marked path, occasionally stopping to take pictures of the breathtaking scenery. After a few hours, I reached a small clearing and decided it was the perfect spot to set up camp. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I lit my campfire, the crackling flames providing warmth against the growing chill. I settled in, enjoying the peaceful solitude. Just as I was about to roast some marshmallows, I noticed something strange in the distance, a dark shape peeking through the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like a cabin, weathered and abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere. What could go wrong? I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the cabin. The closer I got, the more I felt a chill run down my spine. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the windows were grimy and cracked. I hesitated at the threshold, a sense of foreboding washing over me. But I pushed the door open, the creak echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. The remnants of furniture lay scattered about, an old chair, a broken table. As I stepped further in, I felt a cold draft, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something unsettling about this place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from somewhere within the cabin. Help me. I froze, my heart racing. Hello, I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I peered into the dim corners of the room, but all I saw was shadows. I turned to leave, but the whispers grew louder, more desperate. Help us, please. Panic surged through me. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut, rattling in its frame. My breath quickened as I backed away, the whispers now a chorus of cries. Join us, join us. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering as I tried to find my way out. Just then, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye, shapes, figures emerging from the shadows, their forms blurred and indistinct. They reached out toward me, hands grasping, mouths moving silently. I turned and charged toward a window, desperate for escape. I hurled myself against it, but the glass held firm. The whispers became a deafening roar, filling my mind with confusion and fear. You shouldn't have come here. With a burst of adrenaline, I dashed toward the back of the cabin, hoping for a rear exit. I pushed through a door that creaked ominously, stumbling into the cool night air. I sprinted into the woods, branches whipping at my face, heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed alive, closing in around me as I ran. I could still hear the whispers, echoing in my ears. Help us, don't leave. After what felt like an eternity, I finally broke free from the trees and spotted my campsite in the distance. I crashed through the underbrush, collapsing beside the fire. It flickered in the darkness, a small beacon of safety. I gasped for breath, my body trembling. The night was still once more, but the whispers lingered in the back of my mind, a haunting reminder of what I had encountered. I packed my gear in a frenzy, every crackle of the fire setting my nerves on edge. As I drove away from Pine Hollow, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those shadowy figures behind me. The woods stood silent, but I knew I would never forget the feeling of being watched, of being drawn into the darkness. I never returned to those woods, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, especially when the wind howls outside my window. It's a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and some stories are not meant to be uncovered. The Mark of the Forest. It was a late summer afternoon when I decided to hike the infamous Raven's Hollow Trail, known for its breathtaking views and eerie tales. Friends had warned me about the strange happenings in those woods, disappearances and unsettling noises, but I dismissed them. I craved adventure and solitude, and nothing could deter me from my plans. The trailhead was marked by a weathered sign, the words Raven's Hollow barely legible. I felt a thrill as I stepped onto the path, surrounded by towering trees. The first couple of miles were enchanting. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, and the air was fresh with the scent of pine. But as I climbed higher, the mood shifted. The forest grew darker, and the sounds of wildlife faded, leaving a heavy silence. I pressed on, the feeling of unease creeping in as shadows lengthened around me. I reached a clearing that overlooked a vast valley. I set my backpack down, marveling at the beauty of it all. But as I took pictures, I noticed something strange in the dirt, a series of small, oddly shaped markings. They looked like deep scratches, almost as if something had clawed at the earth. Unease twisted in my gut, but I brushed it off as nothing. As I prepared to head back, the whispers began, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. Come, come. My heart raced. I called out, hello, but received no answer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Come, follow. Against my better judgment, I turned away from the trail, compelled by the sound. I pushed through the underbrush, following the voices deeper into the woods. With each step, I felt as if the forest was closing in around me, the trees watching with ancient eyes. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin, hidden beneath layers of vines and moss. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior. I hesitated, but the whispers beckoned me inside. Help us, come. I stepped over the threshold, flashlight in hand. The air was musty, filled with the scent of rot. As I explored the cabin, I found remnants of lives once lived, old photographs, dusty furniture, and a single unlit candle on a table. In the center of the room, strange symbols were carved into the wood floor. Suddenly, the whispers turned into frantic cries. Help us! Help us! I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing that I wasn't alone. Shadows flickered in the corners of the cabin, figures lurking just beyond the reach of my light. Join us! Join us! Panic surged through me as I backed toward the door, but the shadows moved closer, their faces indistinct, mouths stretched in silent screams. I sprinted back into the woods, adrenaline pushing me forward, the whispers now a cacophony of pleas. The forest felt like a labyrinth, branches reaching out as if trying to ensnare me. I could hear them following, their whispers intertwining with the rustling leaves. Stay, don't leave. I burst through the trees, gasping for air as I finally spotted the main trail. Relief flooded through me as I raced toward it, but the moment I reached the familiar path, I felt an odd weight on my chest. I looked down and saw a dark mark etched into my skin, resembling the symbols from the cabin. Horrified, I stumbled back toward my car, the whispers still echoing in my mind. I could feel their presence, cold and malevolent, creeping closer with every step. Once inside the car, I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see shadowy figures lurking in the trees. The forest stood silent, but I could still hear the whispers, faint but persistent. "Help us! Join us!" I never returned to Raven's Hollow, but the mark on my skin remained, a constant reminder of what I had encountered. Sometimes, when the wind howls outside, I hear the whispers calling to me, urging me to return. And though I've tried to ignore them, I know I'll never truly be free from the forest's grasp. The echoes in the woods. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping trip to the remote Echo Pines National Park. Known for its stunning landscapes and serene atmosphere, it was the perfect getaway. I packed my gear, loaded up on snacks, and hit the road early one Saturday morning, eager to disconnect and recharge. The first day was everything I had hoped for. I hiked the well-marked trails, breathing in the fresh air and taking in the breathtaking views of the mountains. By the time the sun began to set, I found a beautiful spot near a small creek to set up my tent. As night fell, I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and listening to the gentle sound of the water flowing nearby. It was peaceful, until I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Shaking off the feeling, I climbed into my tent, hoping to get some rest. But sleep eluded me. It wasn't long before I heard it, a faint echo, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Help! Help!" I bolted upright, heart racing. "Is someone there?" I called out, but the only answer was silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the night, but the whisper returned, clearer this time. "Help me, please." I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside, my flashlight illuminating the surrounding trees. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. But there was nothing, only the whispering wind and the distant sound of the creek. Pushing my fear aside, I decided to investigate. The whispers seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. I took a deep breath and ventured into the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying as if trying to warn me. As I moved further in, I began to feel disoriented. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, tugging at my mind. "Come follow." The air turned colder, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. I stumbled into a small clearing where the echoes resonated around me, almost like a chorus of voices. "Help us! Help us!" In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone, its surface covered in strange markings. It looked ancient, and as I approached, a sense of dread washed over me. The whispers grew frantic. "Join us. Stay." Suddenly, I was overwhelmed with the feeling of being watched. I turned, shining my flashlight around the clearing, but saw nothing, just shadows dancing in the beam. Panic surged through me. I needed to leave. I turned to retrace my steps, but the path had vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Frantically, I ran in what I thought was the direction of my camp, but the forest felt alive, twisting and shifting around me. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft and shuffling as if someone or something was following. "Help us!" The voices screamed now, an anguished plea that echoed through the trees. My heart raced as I stumbled and fell, the flashlight rolling away and plunging me into darkness. The whispers closed in, a cacophony of desperate cries that made my skin crawl. I scrambled to my feet, desperately searching for my light. Finally, I spotted it, flickering on the ground. I reached for it and turned it back on, the beam cutting through the night. The clearing was empty, but the whispers continued, a haunting melody that filled the air. With adrenaline coursing through me, I took off again, running blindly through the woods. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. I sprinted toward it, collapsing beside the fire, gasping for breath. The whispers faded as I huddled close to the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I stayed by the fire all night, too scared to sleep, listening to the night sounds slowly return as dawn broke. When I finally gathered the courage to pack up and leave, I made sure to avoid the path where I had heard the whispers. As I drove away from Echo Pines, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking among the trees. I never returned to those woods, but sometimes I can still hear the echoes of those desperate voices in my dreams, calling out for help. It's a haunting reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and that the forest has secrets it might not want to share. The Hollow Grove. After months of planning, I finally set out for my solo camping trip to Hollow Grove, a secluded area in the backcountry that promised stunning views and tranquility. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, and I was eager to immerse myself in nature. The first day was perfect. I hiked for hours, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sounds of wildlife. As the sun began to set, I found a picturesque clearing next to a bubbling brook and set up my tent, feeling content. As darkness fell, I lit my campfire, the flames flickering in the growing night. I pulled out my journal, jotting down thoughts while the sound of the water lulled me into a state of peace. That's when I first noticed the whispers, a faint sound drifting through the trees, like leaves rustling in the wind. Help! Help! I froze, straining to hear. Was someone out there? I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" but received no reply, just the whispering wind. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the unease settled deep in my gut. As I lay in my tent later, the whispers returned, more distinct this time. "Help us! Help us!" My heart raced. Is this a joke? I whispered to myself, half expecting a friend to jump out from behind a tree. But the forest remained silent, save for the unsettling echoes that seemed to come from all directions. Desperate to quell my fear, I crawled out of the tent and switched on my flashlight, pointing it into the darkness. The beam illuminated the trees, but nothing seemed out of place. I convinced myself it was just the woods playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something, faint, shadowy figures moving just beyond the tree line. I squinted, trying to make them out, but they disappeared as quickly as they appeared. The whispers swelled again, an overwhelming chorus of pleas. "Join us, don't leave." Panic surged through me. I dashed back to my tent, my heart pounding in my ears. I zipped the flap shut and lay there, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the whispers continued, wrapping around me like a shroud. Hours passed, and I finally drifted into a restless sleep. I was jolted awake by a loud crash outside my tent. My heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap, peering into the darkness. The campfire had died down, leaving only embers glowing softly. Suddenly, the whispers rose to a fever pitch, echoing all around me. "Help us! Help us!" I stumbled out of my tent, frantically shining my light around, but the forest seemed to close in. The figures returned, moving among the trees, their features indistinct, but their intentions clear. They were drawing closer. "Stay with us, forever," they whispered, their voices twisting and mingling in the air. In a blind panic, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my skin. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, hear their desperate cries growing louder. The trail felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't find my way back to safety. As I fled, I tripped and fell into a shallow ravine, landing hard on the ground. I struggled to get up, fear pulsing through me, but the whispers were all around now, echoing off the trees. "You shouldn't have come here." With adrenaline coursing through me, I fought to climb out, heart racing, eyes darting for any sign of the figures. Finally, I reached the top, my flashlight flickering weakly as I sprinted back toward my campsite. But the clearing was gone. In its place was an unfamiliar expanse of trees, thick and impenetrable. I felt a sense of hopelessness wash over me as the whispers grew more frantic. "Join us! Join us!" I turned to run in another direction, desperately trying to escape, but the trees felt alive, their branches twisting as if reaching for me. I could hear them now, dozens of voices crying out, echoing my fear. Just when I thought I'd lost all hope, I stumbled back onto a familiar path. The campfire flickered in the distance. I dashed toward it, collapsing next to the dying flames. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, but at least I was safe for now. I packed my gear in a frenzy, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the straps. The whispers faded into the night, but I knew they would always be there, lurking just beyond the trees. As I drove away from Hollow Grove, I glanced back at the dark woods, my heart heavy with dread. I could still hear the faint echoes of those desperate voices, a haunting reminder that some places hold secrets better left undiscovered. I would never return to those woods, and I hoped the whispers would eventually fade from my memory. The lantern's light. I've always loved hiking, especially in the fall when the leaves turned brilliant shades of orange and red. This year, I decided to venture to Willow Creek, a lesser-known trail that promised breathtaking views and a serene atmosphere. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, excited to spend the weekend in the wilderness. The first day passed beautifully. I hiked through vibrant forests, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. As evening approached, I found a perfect spot by a small pond to set up camp. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and settled in for a night of stargazing. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere changed. A heavy fog rolled in, wrapping the trees in an eerie embrace. I tried to ignore the growing unease as I prepared dinner, but the whispers began soon after. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation, but gradually grew louder. "Help! Help!" I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. After finishing my meal, I decided to take a walk around the pond. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a cold shroud. That's when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance, moving slowly through the trees. Curiosity overcame my fear. I followed the light, pushing through the dense fog. As I got closer, I realized it was a lantern, its soft glow illuminating the surroundings. But there was no one holding it. The light floated a few feet above the ground, beckoning me to follow. "Come, come." The whispers intensified, pulling me closer. I hesitated, unsure if I should follow, but the allure of the lantern was too strong. I moved deeper into the woods, the fog swirling around me. As I trailed behind the lantern, I noticed the landscape changing. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whispers became a frantic chorus, echoing through the mist. "Join us. Help us." Panic gripped me as I realized how far I had strayed from my camp. I turned to retrace my steps, but the fog seemed to swallow the familiar path. The lantern continued to drift away, and I was left standing in the darkness, the whispers growing louder and more desperate. "Stay with us forever." Heart racing, I ran in what I hoped was the right direction, my flashlight flickering weakly against the suffocating fog. The whispers echoed around me, a cacophony of voices pleading and crying. I stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at my arms. Suddenly, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing among the trees, shrouded in shadow. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes boring into me. The whispers turned into a singular voice, deeper and more commanding. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, terror washing over me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The figure stepped closer, and I could make out the flickering light of the lantern behind it. "Help us! Help us!" it repeated, the voices mixing into an anguished plea. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and sprinted through the woods, the weight of the fog pressing down on me. I could feel the figure following, the whispers chasing me, each step heavy with despair. "Join us! Join us!" I burst back into the clearing by the pond, the fog starting to lift as the lantern flickered and faded away. I collapsed beside my tent, gasping for breath. The forest was still again, but the echoes of the voices lingered in my mind, an unsettling reminder of what I had encountered. I packed my things quickly, fear tightening my chest as I prepared to leave. The whispers had faded, but I could still feel their presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to wander too far. As I drove away from Willow Creek, I glanced in a rearview mirror. The forest stood silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I knew I would never return to those woods, and I hoped the haunting whispers would eventually leave me in peace. The Watchers. After a stressful few months at work, I decided to take a weekend camping trip to Cedar Ridge, a remote area known for its breathtaking views and serene environment. I packed my gear and set off early Saturday morning, excited to disconnect from everything. The hike to my chosen campsite was beautiful, with towering pines and the gentle sound of a nearby stream. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearing with a perfect view of the valley below and set up my tent. As evening approached, I gathered firewood and lit a small campfire, enjoying the warm glow as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness fell, I settled in with a book, but I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The woods were unnaturally quiet, and I felt as though eyes were watching me from the shadows. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but when I heard the faint rustling of leaves nearby, my heart raced. Just the wind, I whispered to myself, but the rustling grew closer, almost deliberate. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. Is anyone there? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I decided to try and distract myself, so I poured a cup of coffee and sat back down by the fire. But then I saw them, figures lurking at the edge of the trees. They were too far away to make out clearly, but I could see dark shapes moving, their forms shifting and swaying as if they were communicating silently. I gripped my flashlight tightly, shining it toward the figures, but they vanished into the darkness, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the night wore on, I heard whispers, soft, barely audible sounds weaving through the trees. Come, join us, they seemed to call, echoing in my mind. I jumped to my feet, fear coursing through me. Who's there? I shouted, but again, only silence responded. Desperate to distract myself, I grabbed my phone to check for signal, but there was none. I felt a rising sense of dread, so I decided to turn in for the night. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I thought I heard footsteps circling my campsite, but exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I eventually drifted off. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a low murmur, voices weaving through my dreams. Startled, I sat up, heart pounding. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the darkness felt heavier than before. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. Join us. Stay with us. Panic surged through me as I unzipped my tent and peered outside. The figures were back, standing just beyond the reach of the dying light, their features still indistinct, but now unmistakably watching me. Their eyes glimmered in the darkness, reflecting the faint light like hungry predators. Go away, I shouted, my voice cracking. But the figures stepped closer, and the whispers became a cacophony of pleas. Help us! Help us! In a blind panic, I grabbed my gear and bolted into the woods, flashlight flickering wildly. I ran, branches snagging at my clothes and skin, the whispers chasing me, filling the air with a sense of despair. I could hear their voices growing louder behind me, echoing through the trees. Join us! Don't leave us! I stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find the trail. Just as I thought I'd lost them, I tripped and fell, tumbling down a small hill and landing hard on the ground. The flashlight slipped from my hand and extinguished, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, fear coursing through my veins as I listened intently. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt suffocating. I couldn't tell which way to go. Panic tightened my chest. Finally, I spotted a faint glimmer in the distance, my campfire. I took off toward it, the glow illuminating the path ahead. I reached the clearing and saw my tent, but the figures were now standing around it, their shapes blending into the shadows. Stay with us, they whispered in unison, voices echoing in my mind. I dashed past them, ignoring the fear clawing at me, and reached my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and finally got the door open. I jumped inside, locking it tight, gasping for breath. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figures standing in the road behind me. The forest was silent, but I could still feel their presence, lurking just beyond the tree line, watching me leave. I never returned to Cedar Ridge, but the memory of that night haunts me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the whispers calling from the darkness, reminding me that some woods hold secrets better left undisturbed. The Forgotten Trail. A few weeks ago, I decided to go camping at Blackstone Wilderness, a sprawling area rumored to have some of the most beautiful but often overlooked trails. I craved solitude and wanted to disconnect from the chaos of daily life, so I packed my gear and headed out early one Saturday morning. The first few hours were blissful. I hiked along a well-marked path, admiring the vibrant autumn foliage and the sounds of birds chirping above. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I stumbled upon a side trail that was less traveled. The sign at its entrance read, "Lost Trail. Proceed at your own risk." Curiosity piqued, I decided to take the detour. The narrow path was overgrown, and the trees loomed overhead, creating an almost tunnel-like effect. I felt a thrill as I ventured further in, the world behind me fading away. After about an hour, I reached a clearing with a stunning view of the valley below. I set up my camp and decided to enjoy my surroundings. As I settled in, the sun began to dip, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it, a low, distant humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I strained to listen, thinking it might be some kind of animal, but the sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. The hair on my arms stood on end. "Hello!" I called out into the darkness, but only silence answered. The hum persisted, now growing louder and closer. I glanced around, my flashlight illuminating the trees, but nothing was there. I felt a chill creep up my spine. As I crawled into my tent, the humming transformed into whispers, soft and haunting. "Come find us. Help us." I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was relentless. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I fought to stay calm. Sleep eluded me, and I lay there, terrified and wide awake. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I was jolted awake by the sound of rustling outside my tent. The whispers had returned, now frantic and desperate. "Join us. Stay with us." I unzipped the tent flap and peered out, flashlight in hand. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the forest was thick with fog. I scanned the area but saw nothing, just the oppressive darkness pressing in around me. I stepped out, compelled by a strange urge to follow the whispers. I took a cautious step into the woods, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. The voices seemed to guide me deeper into the trees, pulling me towards something I couldn't quite understand. "Help us! Help us!" My heart raced as I stumbled over roots and rocks, trying to keep my bearings. The further I went, the more the whispers wrapped around me, filling my mind with their anguish. "You shouldn't have come here." Finally, I broke into another clearing, this one larger and eerily silent. In the center stood an ancient tree, gnarled and twisted, its bark scarred with strange markings. I felt drawn to it, as if it held some terrible secret. Suddenly, I was surrounded by figures, shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering words I couldn't understand, but their intent was clear. They wanted me to join them. Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee. I dashed back through the trees, the whispers morphing into screams, the figures pursuing me. "Don't leave us! Help us!" I sprinted blindly, branches clawing at my clothes, until I finally burst back into my campsite. I collapsed beside the dying fire, gasping for breath. The shadows receded, but I could still hear their cries echoing in the darkness. "Stay, forever." In a frenzy, I packed my gear and fled the clearing, heart racing as I retraced my steps back to the main trail. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting as I stumbled toward my car. When I finally reached the parking lot, I threw my gear into the trunk, shaking with fear. I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see the figures watching me from the shadows. But the trees stood still, shrouded in silence. As I drove away from Blackstone Wilderness, I felt the weight of their sorrow lingering in the air, a haunting reminder that some paths should never be taken. I vowed never to return, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the whispers calling from the depths of the forest. The Bone Hollow. A friend and I decided to embark on a weekend camping trip to Bone Hollow, a rugged area known for its stunning cliffs and ancient trees. The name had always intrigued me. Local legends spoke of lost souls and eerie happenings. Still, I brushed it off as mere folklore, eager for an adventure. We arrived on a Friday evening, setting up camp near a tranquil river. The sun was setting, casting golden hues over the landscape, and I felt a sense of peace as we roasted marshmallows and shared stories by the fire. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I noticed the forest growing eerily quiet. My friend laughed it off, but I felt an unsettling tension in the air. After a while, I decided to venture a little farther up the trail, wanting to explore a nearby overlook while there was still some light. The trail was narrow, and as I climbed, I could hear faint rustling in the underbrush, but I convinced myself it was just small animals. Reaching the overlook, I was struck by the view. The valley stretched out beneath me, illuminated by the moonlight, and I felt exhilarated. But then I noticed something peculiar, a cluster of bones scattered among the rocks below. I squinted, realizing they were animal bones, but something about the arrangement felt wrong, unnatural. I stepped back, a chill creeping down my spine. The air grew colder, and I turned to head back to camp. As I descended, the whispers began, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but gradually growing more distinct. "Help us! Help us!" I paused, heart racing. "Hello!" I called out, but only silence answered. I quickened my pace, the whispers intensifying. "Stay with us. Join us." When I finally returned to camp, my friend was sitting by the fire, his expression serious. "Did you get that?" he asked, glancing nervously into the darkness. "Hear what?" I replied, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "Voices, like someone's calling out." "It's been happening for a while," he said, looking at me with concern. I didn't want to admit that I had heard them too. We sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between us, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave. As the night deepened, we climbed into our tent, trying to dismiss the odd occurrences. But sleep was elusive. I lay there, tossing and turning, when I was suddenly jolted awake by a loud thud outside. My friend sat up, wide-eyed. "What was that?" I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering into the darkness. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the night was heavy with fog. The whispers had returned, echoing around us. "Help us! Join us!" Suddenly, we heard a soft, eerie laughter. It sent chills down my spine. My friend and I exchanged a terrified glance. "We need to go," I whispered. We scrambled to pack our gear, but the whispers grew more frantic, surrounding us. "Stay, stay." Just then, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me. "What do we do?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Stay close to me," my friend said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. We crept out of the tent, the shadows closing in around us. I could feel something moving just beyond the edge of the light. Shapes darted in the fog, their whispers intertwining with our breaths. "You shouldn't have come here." We bolted, sprinting through the thick mist, desperately trying to find the main trail. The forest felt alive, branches grasping at us like skeletal hands. "Help us! Help us!" the voices wailed, echoing through the trees. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing that looked vaguely familiar. "This way!" I shouted, and we ran toward the car, the whispers turning into a chaotic cacophony of cries. "Join us! Help us!" We reached the car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking. As the headlights flickered on, we turned to look back at the forest, but it was silent now, the figures hidden among the trees. Once we were inside, I locked the doors and slammed the car into gear, peeling away from the campsite. The forest receded in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes following us. As we drove away from Bone Hollow, the whispers faded into the night, but I knew we had barely escaped something dark and ancient. I'd vowed never to return, and sometimes, in quiet moments, I still hear those ghostly voices echoing in my mind, a chilling reminder of what lies hidden in the shadows. The Echoing Woods. Eager for an escape from the city, I decided to take a solo trip to the Echoing Woods, a remote area known for its breathtaking landscapes and peaceful solitude. As I packed my gear, I felt a sense of anticipation. This was just what I needed. After a long drive and a few hours of hiking, I finally set up camp in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over everything. I lit a fire, made dinner, and settled in for a night of stargazing. As darkness enveloped the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt thick and charged, and the silence around me was almost oppressive. I tried to focus on the sounds of the crackling fire and the rustling leaves, but my thoughts kept drifting. Then I heard it, soft, melodic whispers echoing through the trees. "Help us, find us." I froze, my heart pounding. "Is anyone there?" I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the darkness. The whispers continued, weaving in and out like a haunting lullaby. They seemed to come from different directions, disorienting me. Uneasy, I decided to turn in for the night. As I crawled into my tent, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Join us. Stay with us." The air felt heavy, and I tried to block out the sounds, but sleep eluded me. Hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud thud outside. I sat up, breathless, straining to listen. The whispers had turned into frantic calls. "Help us! Help us!" Terrified, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was low, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. I couldn't see anything but the faint glow of embers. Gathering my courage, I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. As I shone the light around, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows flitting between the trees. The whispers intensified, echoing around me, sounding desperate. "Find us! Help us! Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. But the forest remained silent except for the whispers that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a girl, no older than 12, with wide eyes and tangled hair. "You have to help us," she cried, her voice filled with urgency. I stumbled back, unsure if she was real or a figment of my imagination. "Help you with what?" "Stay away from the hollow," she pleaded, pointing deeper into the woods. "They want to take you." Before I could respond, she vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. "Join us. Stay with us." Panic surged through me, and I turned to run back to my tent. But as I reached it, I felt a cold wind sweep past me, extinguishing the fire and plunging me into darkness. The whispers morphed into a chorus of wails, echoing in the night. "Help us! Help us!" they cried, desperate and mournful. I dashed into the tent, fumbling for my phone to use as a light. The screen flickered to life, casting a weak glow around me. I could hear something moving outside, shuffling and rustling, the whispers turning into unintelligible shouts. "Leave! Leave now!" In a panic, I threw my gear into my backpack and unzipped the tent, bursting into the night. The woods were alive with shadows, darting just out of reach. The cries echoed around me. "Stay with us." I sprinted down the trail, the beam of my phone's light bouncing wildly as I ran. I could feel the shadows pressing in, the whispers rising to a fever pitch. "Help us! Join us!" The path seemed to twist and turn, disorienting me. Just when I thought I would lose my way, I stumbled into a familiar clearing. I could see the faint glow of my campfire in the distance. I ran toward it, my heart racing, desperate to escape the whispers. As I reached the clearing, I felt a sudden stillness. The air was heavy, charged with tension. I grabbed my gear and bolted for my car, glancing back at the woods one last time. But as I turned the ignition, the whispers returned, a final desperate plea. "Help us! Help us!" I sped away from echoing woods, the road winding under the cover of trees. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the girl standing at the edge of the woods watching me leave. But the forest remained silent, holding its secrets close. I knew I would never return to those woods, and the whispers would linger in my mind, a haunting reminder that some places should remain untouched. The keeper of the forest. After a long week, I decided to spend the weekend hiking in the Pin Shadow Forest, a remote area known for its dense woods and serene beauty. I was excited to unplug and immerse myself in nature. Packing my gear, I felt a sense of anticipation as I drove toward the trailhead. The hike was invigorating. The towering trees and the sound of birds chirping filled me with peace. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing and decided it was the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent near a small creek, enjoying the soothing sound of water flowing over rocks. As night fell, I built a fire and cooked dinner, but the atmosphere shifted. The forest grew eerily quiet, the sounds of wildlife fading into an unsettling silence. I felt a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the temperature. That night, as I sat by the fire, I began to hear faint voices drifting through the trees. They were soft at first, almost like a distant melody. I strained to listen, thinking it might be the wind playing tricks on me. But the whispers grew louder, now clear and melodic, echoing through the darkened woods. "Come play with us. Come play." I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the area around my camp. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly, but there was no response. The fire crackled, and the whispers grew more insistent, almost beckoning me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the sound deeper into the forest, my heart racing. The trees loomed above, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky. The whispers led me to a small clearing I hadn't seen before, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the leaves. In the center stood an ancient tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled, with deep grooves running down its bark. I felt a pull toward it, an almost magnetic attraction. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a gentle breeze. "Stay with us, forever." Just then, I noticed figures emerging from the shadows. Children, their faces pale and eyes wide, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. They wore tattered clothes and looked as if they had been lost for a long time. "Who are you?" I stammered, my heart pounding. "We play here," one of them replied, pointing at the ancient tree. "It's safe. Come join us." Panic surged through me. "I can't. I have to go back." The children's expressions shifted, their eyes darkening. "You don't understand. You can't leave. Not now." The whispers turned into a cacophony of pleas. "Help us! Help us!" I turned to run, the shadows closing in around me. As I fled back through the trees, I could hear their laughter, now twisted and mocking. "You can't escape." Desperately, I sprinted toward my campsite, the whispers echoing behind me. "Join us. Stay with us." When I finally burst into the clearing, my breath came in ragged gasps. I collapsed beside the dying fire, heart racing, but the darkness felt heavy, suffocating. The forest was silent once more, but I knew they were watching. I packed my gear quickly, shaking with fear. I needed to get out of there. As I stumbled toward the trail, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. Suddenly, the whispers returned, softer this time, but filled with an eerie longing. "We just want to play." I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the forest floor. The path felt endless, twisting and turning, as if the woods were shifting around me. I could hear the children's laughter echoing in my mind, and the words played over and over. "Help us. Stay with us." Finally, I reached my car, heart racing. I threw my gear inside and slammed the door shut, locking it tight. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the children standing there, waiting for me to return. But the trees stood still, shrouded in darkness. I drove away, leaving Penny Shadow Forest behind, but the echoes of those whispers haunted me long after I had left. I would never forget the faces of the children or the chilling invitation to join them. As I made my way home, I knew that some places held secrets too dark to uncover, and some whispers should never be followed. The Lantern's Light. Last fall, I set out for a weekend camping trip to the remote Silver Pines, a place known for its breathtaking views and eerie legends. I had heard stories about campers going missing and strange lights flickering in the woods at night, but I shrugged them off as urban myths, perfect for adding some thrill to my adventure. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon, excited to embrace the solitude. The hike to my chosen campsite was beautiful. The air was crisp, and the trees stood tall and proud. I set up my tent near a clear stream, feeling at peace as I settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire and roasted some dinner. But as darkness fell, I noticed something odd. The forest around me seemed to come alive with sounds I hadn't heard before. Whispers floated on the breeze, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. It was as if the trees were sharing secrets. After dinner, I decided to explore a little. I grabbed my flashlight and followed a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder, and soon I came upon a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered lantern hanging from a crooked post, its glass panels cracked and dirty. The sight was strange, but what drew me in was the faint glow flickering within. I stepped closer, and to my astonishment, the lantern illuminated a circle on the ground. It felt warm and inviting, but a sense of dread washed over me. I was drawn to it despite myself. "Help us, find us," the whispers urged, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to stay. Suddenly, the glow of the lantern intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced around me. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Who are you?" I called into the darkness, but only the whispers answered. "Stay with us, join us." The air felt thick, and I stumbled backward, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Just as I turned to run, the lantern's light flickered violently, and I saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing like embers. I bolted back toward my campsite, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The figures followed, their whispers morphing into frantic cries. "Help us! Don't leave us!" Panic surged through me as I reached my tent. I could hear the rustling behind me, the shadows closing in. I grabbed my backpack, heart pounding, and fled into the woods. The path twisted and turned, and I could feel the weight of their presence behind me, relentless. "Join us! Stay with us!" they wailed, their voices echoing through the trees. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands against the rough ground. My flashlight flickered again, and I fumbled to turn it back on, breathless and terrified. The figures were now surrounding me, their forms indistinct, but their intentions clear. I finally found the main trail and took off down it, desperate for escape. The whispers faded slightly but still echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of their pleas. I ran until I reached my car, throwing my gear inside in a panic. As I locked the doors and started the engine, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see the lantern still flickering in the distance. But there was nothing, just darkness, heavy and oppressive. As I sped away from Silver Pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. The whispers haunted me for weeks, invading my dreams. Sometimes I would wake in a cold sweat, hearing the cries echoing in the stillness of the night. I knew I would never return to that forest, and I couldn't shake the chilling thought that the lantern was still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting camper to answer its call.